Invasion of Time, the sixth serial and final serial of season 15 of Doctor Who, first broadcast in 6 parts from the 4th of February to the 11th of March 1978. There's also the last story to feature Louise Jameson in the role of Leela, and the last story for the first iteration of K9, voiced by John Leeson. And while I don't think this episode is this story is the worst story of Doctor Who, however, this one to me just seems weird. I mean, apparently they went through a lot of different ideas and shuffling before they eventually decided on this particular story. The original one was supposedly called The Killers of the Dark and would have involved kind of a planet full of cat people, an arena full of cat people, and would have supposedly ended with Leela's death. Like, Louise Jameson actually asked for Leela to be killed off to give her an exit for the show, which I think is understandable, especially when you look at Leela's character. I mean, she was a warrior. To die in battle, that would be the ultimate honour for her. But they ultimately deemed it, one, too expensive to film a story like The Killers of the Dark, and two, they didn't necessarily want to traumatise children by showing the death of a companion. Now, while that would ultimately change later down the line with the death of Adric, the ultimate story they came up with here, I just think it's enjoyable enough, but I think it's just a bit odd. So the Fourth Doctor, played by Tom Baker, he is shown at the start of the story seemingly making a deal, writing a contract with a group of aliens called the Vardans. And he then returns to Gallifrey and, in quite a dark move for him, claims presidentship over Gallifrey, stating he's the only person who was open. He was the only person selected for the job, so he goes and assumes presidentship of Gallifrey, which is already odd, and then he proceeds to do more dark things, including banishing Leela from the Citadel, which is pretty dark for him, and then announces to Peter Gallifrey that he is inviting a new breed of aliens in to essentially be in charge, to rule over them, those being the Vardans. And this seemingly having been a dark plan for the Vardans to invade using the Doctor as a pawn. Now, it's already pretty dark, and he teams up along the way. You've got a load of Time Lords and Time Ladies gathered along the way who interact with all this, including Chancellor Barusa, played by John Arnott, who seemingly acts as both a roadblock and as an ally to the Doctor throughout the story. A man named Castellan Kellner, played by Milton Johns, a royal guard named Andred, played by Chris Tranchell, and a Time Lady named Rodan, played by Hilary Ryan. But it's ultimately revealed that the Vardans were more of a pawn, and the Doctor was actually planning to kind of double-cross them and send them away, but then there's a double side to it. As by the end of part 4, they've been able to banish the Vardans and everything can seemingly get back to normal, but then it's revealed that the Vardans were merely being used as pawns, not by the Doctor, but by the Sontarans. And they plan to... The Vardans managed to manipulate the Doctor into creating a hole in the force field around Gallifrey so that the Vardans could slip through. The Doctor manages to reverse engineer this to send them away, but then the Sontarans use that hole to invade, and plan to use the power of the Time Lords and essentially to conquer time itself. And yeah, I mean, I feel if they had let it be known the Sontarans were coming first off, this would have been an okay story. I mean, seeing the Sontarans essentially take over Gallifrey, that would have been quite interesting to see throughout the entire thing, but introducing it at the end of part 4 and then it being the main focus of parts 5 and 6, the Sontarans just feel a little tacked on. That's all I'm going to say on it. And the Castellan Kellner, played by Milton John, he kind of allies himself with the Sontarans, wanting to kick the Doctor off the throne. Which I can kind of understand. I mean, he saw the Doctor as kind of a fool, so being able to put someone he could seemingly trust in charge, maybe that was his reasoning. But also the Sontarans, I feel here, are not very well acted. I mean, it's not necessarily the actor's fault. Maybe it might have been the director's fault. A bad director can easily mislead a good actor, but the head Sontaran, Storr, played by Derek Deadman, he kind of gives the Sontarans his whispery voice, Sontaran this whispery voice, but then he also kind of tries to make it sound not necessarily cockney, but kind of war tough and ardent. But it just comes off sounding a bit like he's a bit constipated, like "We must invade Gallifrey," and I was kind of giggling behind my hand at a lot of it. So I don't know if the Sontarans used the best here. Barusa, I think, played by John Arnott, is actually used pretty well. He would later return in later stories, including Arc of Infinity, which I haven't seen, and the Five Doctors as essentially the big overarching villain of the whole thing, which I have seen. And although he's played by a different actor at the time, he's played by Philip Latham. John Arnott here, I think, does a good job showing the kind of wise mentor, but then also the guy who's a bit bitter about everything. I feel he does well. Now, one thing I will say about this story that does bring it up a little level is, if you might remember in The Name of the Doctor, when Clara jumps into the Doctor's time stream and ends up separating herself across the Doctor's timeline, the points you can see of the Fourth Doctor walking towards the screen down a green corridor, that's actually from this story. They use clips, or altered clips, from the Invasion of Time in The Name of the Doctor, which does bring it up a level. But then it also comes down a level at the ending, because as I said, this was the last story to feature Louise Jameson as Leela, and rather than give her a kind of a warrior's death a send-off, at the end of it she chooses to stay behind on Gallifrey, which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, but then when the Doctor asks her why, she turns around and joins hands with Andred, played by Chris Tranchell. And while I'm not necessarily against Leela having a relationship and falling in love, to me it just seems a little forced, because they try and play it off like, oh, they've really connected and she's fallen in love with him, but the two of them rarely shared any screen time together, barely even shared a word, and then you see this all the time in movies, just like, was there really a connection? I don't really understand why that's supposed to work. Oh well. There's also quite a funny mishap. I think it's in either part 5 or part 6, where the Sontaran kind of jumps across the edge of the pool and trips up and trips over a chair, which apparently was left in the story, but they later explained it away by saying, oh, well, there's a much higher gravity on Sontar, so that's why he was a little discombobulated. And it's just a little weird that they still kept that in. They didn't try and reshoot it. They're just like, yeah, we'll work with this. I mean, as I said, I don't think the Invasion of Time is the worst story in Doctor Who, but it's definitely one of the weirdest. As I said, this was the last one to feature Leela as a companion, and this particular version of K9, with at the end of the story the Doctor re-entering the TARDIS, exiting the planet, and then moving a box into the TARDIS, and on the box, K9 Mark II. Supposedly they wanted to write K9 off because controlling him on the set was proving problems, but the character proved popular enough that they brought him back for a Mark II. So, yeah, he stuck around for a bit longer. So, that's my quick review of The Invasion of Time. As I said, it's not necessarily the worst, but I think it's definitely one of the weirdest side. I feel Leela deserved a much better ending than this, but for what we got, it's entertaining enough. I suggest watching it at least once through, maybe twice, but yeah. That's my quick review of The Invasion of Time. Will my next Class Doctor Who story be? Honestly, at this point, I have no idea. I'll have to wait and see. Till then, see ya.